on the principles. So that's the first question, and there are these three different possibilities. The next question is, when are the boundaries being delimited? When do you make these changes? Most countries in the world have some kind of indication of when it should be done. But it varies a lot. Most cases are around 10 years. Most countries that we've done the survey with said that it should be done every 10 years, and most often that is because a census is conducted every 10 years. So every time that the census is conducted, they draw the boundaries again. Many countries are around 5 to 7 years. New Zealand, Australia falls there. There are other countries where there's just a general indication of after there's a census, or after you can see that the variation between the districts changes. The reason why it should be done regularly is because the population changes. People move to urban areas, the age differentiation changes, etc. But most countries in the world have some kind of official process whereby the boundary should be delimited at a specific time. If you look at the criteria, and this is the one that I think that you would probably be most interested at this stage. What we're talking about here is population equality. This goes all the way back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, where both of them state in the articles that deal with electoral rights that there should be equal suffrage. Now, it just states equal suffrage. It doesn't define what equal suffrage actually means. But most countries, or many countries in the world, have some requirement in their constitution of some measure of equality between the different people. And the way in which equality is interpreted is in the ratio of the number of voters per seat. The interesting thing is, this is operationalized very differently in different countries. It varies for the House of Representatives, where there's almost zero tolerance for a difference, to about 5% that's acceptable in New Zealand. In Australia and other countries like Croatia, quite a few countries, it's 10%. In Australia, it's interesting because the Boundary Delimitation Authority tries to keep it around 2-3% in the beginning, so that they have a margin to move around. 15% in Germany, I think it's also 15% in Mexico. And then Canada is the outlier, and it's around 25, and in some cases up to 33% that they allow in Canada. So the question is, why is this? That the countries operationalize what equality means so differently. The reason for that relates to what we're going to discuss next. But I just want to focus a little bit on Canada, on this last example here, because I think that's instructive. In Canada is, as you know, geographically the biggest country in the world. It has the biggest territory. But it does not even close to the population. So it's a massive country with areas that are very sparsely populated. So in Canada, when they started looking at these things, they started realizing that there's a huge discrepancy between the ratio of voters per seat in the urban areas and in the rural areas specifically around Saskatchewan, Manitoba, etc. And there were a series of processes through the Boundary Delimitation Authority and court cases where they've made some exceptions and they made some rules. So the first thing that they said was that no state will have fewer seats in the lower house of parliament than what they have in the upper house. And secondly, they fixed it at 1976, and they said that no district will lose seats from the seats that they had in 1976. So even if a population drops below a certain amount, they will keep that seat. And that's specifically to safeguard some of the rural areas. But if you do that, you cannot have perfect equality. And that's why to be able to cope with that requirement of those rural interests need to be represented in Parliament. That's why Canada had to make that distinction. Now that's very different from Australia. In Australia, they stick with the 10% variation. So in Australia, you have these huge differences between, in Sydney, for instance, in the center of Sydney, you would have a district that's about 10 square kilometers in geographic size because of the number of voters that it should have per seat. In Western Australia, you would have a district that is geographically the size of 3 times of Egypt with one representative. So compare 10 square kilometers with the geographically that size of Egypt. A very, very huge difference. And that's because Canada and Australia interprets this notion of equality differently. In Canada, they say it's important to have the rural interests represented. In Australia, they say equality is the top priority, and they should keep it within that 10% margin, which makes it very difficult for one representative to represent an area that is 3 times the geographic area of Egypt. Is extremely difficult, and people are raising that as a concern, but they are sticking to that one requirement. The question also becomes, what do people use to determine these figures? And when we look at there, in the survey that we've done, about 53% of the countries use the total population, in other words, census data, for that. So they look at how many people are there in that area, irrespective of where people come from, etc. About 34% countries look at the voter register. And then there are about 6% of the countries that we looked at that use citizens of the country as the figure that they're looking at. Now, obviously, all 3 of those have problems. Census data is not always that reliable, depending on where it is being done, and populations change, and you capture everything. I mean, look at a country like Jordan, where I'm coming from. If you do a census there, you'll find lots of Iraqis and Syrians and Palestinians and etc. there. It's not only people from Jordan that are in the country. So it's problematic for countries to always rely on, but 53% of the countries say our overall population data with the census data is good enough. Voter register is also problematic because not everybody goes to register. So if you have problems in terms of voter registration in certain areas, then it gives you a wrong impression of how many people really are in those areas. So again, that is problematic. And then 6% of places say they only look at the citizens. So they would look at a national civil registry database, etc. I think it's interesting here that you can look at Egypt, and from what I've heard is that you use some level of combination of these different ones in Egypt, and we can look at that in a moment. The other criteria that are, and I'll go quickly through that, and I think I need to come to the end of my presentation, but other criteria that are being considered are things like geography, topography. Very often people say try to use natural boundaries, use rivers, use mountains, use things like that. Existing administrative boundaries is a big one. Many countries try and keep the electoral district to correspond to existing administrative boundaries. But if you work with existing administrative boundaries, you run into problems. One country that had lots of problems related to that is Japan, because in Japan they have both equality and existing boundaries that are top priorities. The problem is, if you have an administrative unit that is bigger than what the average is, what is determined that all districts should have that same number, then you need to take smaller components out of that district and add it to another district. And the moment that you start doing that, you play with people's sensibilities of, they know that I am from this area and they know the administrative boundaries. So if you take some people from an administrative district and you put them in another district, you run into problems. So there you have one of the key things that you have to do in boundary delimitation is, how do you balance these? How do you, these different criteria, how do you balance equality with keeping administrative boundaries intact? Because the numbers of the populations may actually vary. Another factor is contiguity, or they don't like districts to be one here, one here, one here. They like districts to be mostly together. Compactness, regular shapes. In Mexico, in their elections, in their law, they actually state that the district boundaries should follow regular geometric shapes. So it should follow regular geometric shapes, rectangles, circles, things like that. Obviously not perfect, but more or less, so that you don't have these funny shapes in that you have in the United States. A few other, one of the biggest criteria is communities of interest. That people who are similar should be put together in a, and that can vary. In Fiji and Papua New Guinea, it's tribes and ethnic origin. In other countries, you're talking about social classes. You would talk about rich people and poor people, or you would talk religious groups in other areas. So it depends on what the country is. But community of interest is a big one that is put in legislation in many different countries. Minority protection is a big one, that the boundaries should be drawn in such a way that minorities are also represented. And then simplicity. But in all of these, in most countries in the world, equality is the number one. So this equality, this notion of equality between the different districts, so that one district is not represented, one representative represents 50,000, in another district 100,000. That's the top one. Try and keep it as equal, but with this level of variation. And then all the others come in. But the problem comes in the balancing. I just want to skip here over a lot of slides that I've prepared here, because I think that's going to take us too long, and get to the last slide in the presentation. The question about international standards and international best practices is a difficult one. And I want to emphasize one thing, and that's the question mark. Please focus on that question mark, because there are no defined international standards for boundary delimitation. I want to repeat that again. There are no defined international standards. But if we look at the experience, IFES has proposed some ideas of things that could be considered as possible international standards and practices. The first thing that we normally put forward is that there should be some level of an impartial authority. If you have an authority that has a vested interest in the outcome of the process, then you're likely to have those funny shapes that you have in the United States. And you're likely to have the boundary delimitation to be done for a specific political purpose. So some level of impartial authority, and those impartial authorities normally mean people who are there based upon the position that they have, with some small representation of all the different political parties. The second one is equality, and that's the one that you'll probably have more questions for, and we've talked a bit there. The third one that looks is community of interest. That there's a trend internationally that most countries try and have communities of interest represented when the boundaries are being drawn. A third one is non-discrimination against minorities, to find some way of making sure that minorities are represented. And then the last one, and that is transparency. And I just want to say a little bit in conclusion about the notion of transparency. When we talk about election administration internationally, transparency is probably one of the biggest values that is being promoted. But when it comes to boundary delimitation, it is particularly important. And I just want to give you one example of how this is done in Australia, to give you an idea of what we're talking about. In Australia, the Boundary Delimitation Authority is appointed. And the Boundary Delimitation Authority first goes through a period of drawing electoral district boundaries in confidence, so they don't make it public. Once they're finalized with it, now remember we said that Australia has a 10% margin. They try and draw those boundaries in the first instance with a 2% margin, right? So they first draw it with a 2% margin, and then they go out, they publish that, and they go around the country and they talk to the political parties, they talk to the different interest groups, and people can make submissions to the Boundary Delimitation Authority to discuss that. And then they go back and they redraw the boundaries, and that's why they leave themselves that little bit of margin of maneuver that they can use in between. So these are the sort of standards. I know that there are a number of specific issues that are relevant for Egypt, but thank you very, very much for this, and I look forward to the discussion that will follow. Thank you very much.
عن تقسيم الدوائر في قضية التمثيل والسلطة. في العراق هناك مفوضية الانتخابات، وأثبتت خلال العشر سنوات أو 12 سنة الماضية أن المفوضين الذين من الممكن أو يكونوا مستقلين إلى درجة ما هم تابعين لأحزاب وكتل سياسية. هل هناك يعني بديل ممكن أكثر استقلالية من مفوضية الانتخابات، من لربما السلطة الخاصة التي تقوم بتقسيم الدوائر وتكون مسؤولة عن هذه القضية، وحتى تكون بديل عن السلطة التشريعية فرضا، وإن كانت السلطة التشريعية هي أكثر استقلالية لربما بحكم تمثيلها لطبقات ومكونات الشعب أكثر من مفوضية الانتخابات. شكرا.
شكرا. أشكرك. تفضل أستاذ حميد. تفضل. أهلا بك.
أنا لي سؤال واحد يعني ضمن مجموعة الأسئلة. الكلام حوالين المعايير واضح، لكن أنا عايز أسأل سؤال حول الخبرة. هل في خبرة دولية في أثناء بعد أو أثناء عملية تقسيم الدوائر على ضوء المعايير الحيادية والمساواة واجتماعات المصالح والتمييز الشفافية في إدارة الحوار المجتمعي قبل اعتماد تقسيم الدوائر؟ هل هناك خبرة دولية بده؟ يعني هل بيحصل ده، حصل ده في خبرات دولية، كان شكله ايه؟ هل بيبقى قبل تمهيدي؟ هل بيبقى بعدي في الحوار المجتمعي قبل عملية اعتماد تقسيم الدوائر؟ شكرا.
شكرا أستاذ حميد. الأمر الخاص بالمسألة المشاركة على أهميته كان غير مقصود به مستر هيرمان المشاركة في عملية الاقتراع فقط، المشاركة أصلا كمان، وده يمكن عطفا على الأستاذ اللي قاله الأستاذ عبد الحميد كمال فيما يتعلق بالمشاركة في عملية الترشيح. إلى أي حد تكون هناك أثر لهذا التقسيم على أهلا الشريف تفضل على عملية المشاركة في الانتخابات ترشيحا وانتخابا؟ طيب احنا امامنا حوالي أمامنا حوالي بتاع 15 دقيقة اللي من خلالها هيتم الرد على معظم هذه النقاط، أمور خاصة بالمحليات، أمور خاصة بالشفافية، علاقة مسألة التقسيم باقتراع المقيمين في الخارج، علاقة التقسيم بالدستور، الأمور الخاصة ببلدان التحول الديمقراطي، تعارض المعايير بعضها والبعض التي سبق وأن ذكرها مستر هيرمان إلى أي حد ربما لو تتعارض الأمور الخاصة بمسألة الاعتراف الدولي بالانتخابات، الأحزاب والرأي العام، المشاركة ترشيحا وانتخابا، إضافة إلى مسألة الحوار المجتمعي كأحد الأمور خاصة ربما في بلدان التحول الديمقراطي التي ممكن الأخذ بها في مسألة التقسيم، على اعتبار ان ما يكونش ما فيش نظام مستقر، لا في مفوضية ولا في دور واضح لأي جهة مستقلة، فربما يكون الحوار المجتمعي أحد الوسائل في ذلك. نترك الدكتور مستر هيرمان للرد على هذه النقاط في 15 دقيقة، فليتفضل. أستاذ أمين.
عندي يعني لو يقدر يدير تجربه بالدوله فيها تحول ديمقراطي، يعني احنا في دول كتير يبقى افضل كده.
نموذج لدول فيها تحول ديمقراطي، وفي دوله فيها تحول ديمقراطي وبتسعى لتقسيم تقسيم الدوائر بشكل في نوع من الشفافيه. اتفضل.
Thank you very, very much for an incredible set of questions. I will try my best to answer these as fully as I can. And I'll take the questions in order as they were asked. So if I forget who asked the question, please bear with me on that. The first question that you asked about municipalities, yes, you're right. I focused on parliamentary elections. The principles for municipal elections are similar, especially if into districts. Mostly municipal elections follow different rules than parliamentary elections in most countries. But if the municipality is subdivided into sub-districts and those sub-districts are represented, the same principles come into play. Who divides it? What rules do they follow to divide? What criteria do they take into account? So I think even though it's a different set of circumstances, you can still apply the principles. But you're right, I focused on parliamentary elections. Before elections, or should this be done after elections? And there was also a question I want to try, the last question that you asked, the question of the social dialogue, is that before or after finalizing the boundaries? I would like to tie these two questions together. First of all, most countries that have a predefined period try to do it in such a way that it is regular but does not follow the electoral calendar. Most countries do it according to the census calendar. So they would have elections every 4 years, but they would have a demarcation every 10 years. So there's not for every election. One of the reasons why many countries would not like to follow the electoral is because much more of an incentive to draw the boundaries just for the next election and to have an outcome on the next election. So if you have a variation, you don't follow the same calendar before or after elections, and if that is a little bit longer than the electoral cycle, then you need to have the the process focused on that election itself. Countries obviously have a problem what if the census and the election is in the same year. Most countries have some kind of provision that the boundary delimitation is then done either before or after the upcoming elections. But normally there's some indication that people try not to coincide it with elections. With your question, should the popular consultation be done before or after, that relates to many of the questions related to the transparency of the process. The consultation in countries where they have a transparent process is normally done before finalizing. And that's where Australia actually has a very interesting process, where they have a first process that is done in confidence by the Boundary Delimitation Authority. They more or less finalize it with very strict standards for themselves, and then there's a popular consultation and dialogue process. And then they finalize only after the dialogue process. And that is then done every 10 years according to the cycle. This problem relates to the question that was asked about the transitional elections, the experience in transitional elections. The regular dialogue that you do every 7 or 10 years that you have in a country like Australia is very different from the conflict. So if you take Iraq, for instance, after the or you take Kosovo, or you take my own country, South Africa, in 1994, when we had the first elections for Mandela. Very often, the electoral system decision is taking boundary delimitation into account. In all three of those examples that I mentioned to you, the decision was to go for proportional representation at the national level so that you don't have to boundaries, because it is such a highly political issue that you take that out. So that, and you just didn't have to have that discussion. That obviously leads to its own problems, but very often in transitional societies, the decision is taken to choose a type of electoral system that you don't have to have these debates and that you defuse the conflict, because there's always conflict on electoral system boundaries. There's not a single country where there's not a big problem. But even in a country like Iraq, where in the first election it was national, then after that it's on provincial basis. So each province has its own share of seats. Even there are some debates about, does this does this belong to this governorate or that governorate? So even in some of those cases there are some of that. But it's so in societies in transition that's normally now societies in transition can be defined in many different ways. There's a big difference between South Africa coming out of apartheid or Kosovo coming out of the period where the Kosovo becomes independent, the first start of that process, and Jordan, for instance, where just work, which is also in a sense in transition. And where boundary delimitation is an issue, but it's a different transition that the country is also going through. But some kind of public dialogue process is important. The question about out-of-country voting that you asked and the relationship with constituencies, that's a very difficult one. And most countries deal with that by not dealing with it. So for instance, many countries would decide that you can vote for only presidential elections, but not for parliamentary elections where you have to vote for the district boundary, because you just don't know which district the people actually belong to. Or you can, if a country has parliamentary elections with one district, the mixed system, then they can out of some seats elected on a national level and some seats on a provincial. I can vote for the seats elected on a national level, not for the seats on the provincial level. So that's how most countries actually deal with it, so they basically take it out. Many countries also say that you can vote for parliamentary elections, but not for municipal elections. So that's, they deal with it by just taking out the problem from there. The question related to two parties and multi-party systems and how those people are represented on the authority, that's it's much easier when you just have, you asked a question, I think. It's much easier if you have only two parties. In Australia, they have two representatives. Parties, and then they have to decide which parties does this person actually represent, and that's always, there's some funny representation coming in. So it is a bit problematic, and that's why in some places you don't have parties represented on the commissions. So that depends from country to country. Some of these commissions are only made up of judges and technical people with their technical background. And this also relates to the role of the judiciary. As I said, normally many of the countries have boundary delimitation authorities, have judges on the boundary delimitation authority. So it's not the judiciary doing it, but they would have the head of the authority would be a judge, and then the senior statistician would be there, and the person responsible for mapping in the country, or the national geographer, or whatever that is called in that country, would then also be on. Some boundary delimitation commissions are made up only out of judges. So that's one part of the answer to your question. The other part of the question is, can it be appealed to? And again, it's different in different countries. Most countries have the courts actually interpret the Constitution. So in many countries, like in India, like in Canada, the principle of equality is determined in the Constitution, but India, for instance, says that the districts should be equal representation as far as is practicable. But it doesn't define what as far as is practicable actually means. Similar in Canada. So then the courts come in and they decide on that. Sometimes it then relates to legislation or to the courts deciding on determining an actual percentage. So that's why many countries actually go and they declare a percentage. Because once you declare the percentage, it gives the or it's 20% or it's 10%. The narrower that percentage is, the more difficult it becomes. Because then you run into problems like, let's say you have an administrative unit, and that unit is bigger than the quota. What do you do with the rest of the people? Or do you? So it becomes very very difficult. So but the courts have played a big role in many countries in defining what that equality actually means, by people being able to appeal to it. The question about applying the principles on the ground, and you refer to the Bible or whatever document that you want to hold this.